they might be able to cobble together an election win.
Can the Liberal brand survive this episode?
You know, it's going to be a challenge without question. From my perspective, you know, we pay the lowest personal income taxes in Canada right now on your first $118,000 of earned income. I think a 15% additional tax cut is not something I'll support. You know, we have ministries that are underfunded at this point in time.
This is the tax cut the Premier announced?
Yes.
3 or 4 days or a week before he announced he was resigning.
Yeah, so as much as the public, you know, you think would enjoy tax cuts, when you're already the lowest tax jurisdiction in the country, putting another 15% on top of that at the time you're facing deficit budgets and underfunded ministries makes no sense to me whatsoever.
Hang on a minute. Have I just heard a politician say he doesn't want a tax cut?
You have heard it in this case, yeah. I mean, if we were...
That's a really risky thing to say, isn't it,
well,
in today's political climate?
It is, but there's a reality. I mean, putting a tax cut in while you're in deficit situation, I don't know many people that if they wanted to...
Did you buy an NDP card or something that I don't know about?
No, I haven't, and nor will I. I can assure you that.
Honestly,
yeah?
Everybody wants tax cuts. Isn't that the game we play here in politics?
You know what? They do... There's a difference, though. In 2001, we brought in a 25% tax cut immediately after being elected. We were one of the highest tax jurisdictions in the country. We certainly became one of the lowest tax immediately following that tax cut. Today, we are the lowest taxed jurisdiction for personal income tax in all of Canada, as I said, on the first 118,000. I certainly would much rather say, you know, I pay low personal income taxes, I have a great competitive advantage, but I also am able to fund the ministries and for the people of British Columbia deliver services that today are underfunded in many cases.
So is your
3 1/2 is an example of one?
In terms of cuts, education has been one of the hardest hit. Since 2002, 191 schools have shut their doors across the province. Class sizes have swelled. The week the Premier announced he was resigning, another 5 in Vancouver alone were being considered for closure.
I'm angry at this process. It stinks. It really does. There's no innovation here, just sad bureaucracy.
It's an emotional issue in a province where the current government says education is a priority.
We've had a really difficult time with this provincial government under Gordon Campbell, and in fact I wouldn't be in this role if it were not for my frustration as a parent when my kids started school. It was back when he was really first in office, and when he had Christy Clark as his education minister, and that was a really confrontational and combative time we saw as a parent watching what was playing out from the province toward the school districts and the teachers union. That was when they stripped the teachers' contract, and morale in schools was at an all-time low, and the cutbacks that we saw due to the province's refusal to fund the salary increases that they had determined at the provincial level was incredibly frustrating. And so I became part of a group of parents across the city lobbying the provincial government to take a different approach to education, and of course that wasn't successful. The same theme continued, and like many parents in Vancouver, I got more involved in standing up to it.
Okay, boys and girls.
So this government, what was their theme in terms of education?
Well, it was interesting because Campbell always campaigned on a promise to protect public education. He
spoke a lot about literacy.
A lot about literacy. It was going to be the golden decade. We were going to be the most literate jurisdiction in the country. And what we saw in reality was exactly the opposite. Under his government, school boards have had to strip their literacy programs. The continued funding pressure. He would go out to the boards of trade and chambers of commerce and say, more funding than ever, fewer kids, it's all fine. Well, we knew in fact the case was very different, is that the costs of operating school districts, and mostly which were determined at the provincial level, the salary increases, the collective agreements, went up and up at a far greater level of any funding increase.
Talk about schools, because it seemed to be on education. He talked about literacy, he talked about making students stronger here, but yet he seemed to be in conflict with the school boards all the time.
Yeah, well, certainly during the early part of his mandate, he had an education minister, Christy Clark, who really decided to take on the union, and that didn't go very well. So I think that he backed off a little bit. I mean, like a lot of areas, Gordon Campbell was aggressive early on on right after he gained power, and then the longer he was in power, the more mellow he tended to get.
Well, we saw massive tax cuts. He announced another round last week. His solution was to cut tax, certainly cut the corporate taxes, come up with a lot of construction type projects. We know he was very close with the construction industry. Anything when you get into labor or that is organized like the BCTF, you know, suddenly the purse strings closed. But what really happened is it was the kids who got caught in the middle and really paid for it under his leadership. So school districts have had to really struggle. We've had a very unwillingness to work with others, I would say. Campbell was characterized by, he was a one-man show. So certainly in education, we find at a local level in governing, it works best when you work well with others. You consult, you discuss. He did none of that.
During Gordon Campbell's time in office, the number of British Columbians living on the streets exploded. Many were former residents of centralized psychiatric institutions that were closed down with the promise that community-based facilities would open in their place. It never happened.
We didn't shift the money. People can't see moving people from institutions to communities as a cost savings. It was the right thing to do to have people living in their communities with a support network and as active members of the community, but it doesn't work unless you move the supports to the community. Instead, that money was put into provincial revenue. We saved the resources by closing down the institutions, and we didn't put the supports in the community. And that meant people on the streets. It meant not enough group homes. It meant not enough support staff to look after people. It meant not enough places for people to go struggle with addictions and mental illness, and it means the kind of life you see in our streets that we really all should be ashamed of.
Few premiers in British Columbia history served as long as Gordon Campbell, and while he was certainly a polarizing figure in the province, he also left his mark, spending billions of dollars rebuilding and replacing much of British Columbia's aging infrastructure.
I think he is one of the best premiers British Columbia ever had. I have colleagues from across the country who came here, and you gave a speech once at our conference, and they were just amazed at the caliber of person he was, the vision he had, the leadership he had. I think it's a real loss, and I think his legacy, once all this mess gets over, will be one that any politician would be proud of.
Your group benefited a lot. There's 4 or 5 bridges that got built.
4 or 5?
All over the province.
There's 4 or 5 bridges just on the Highway 1. So the infrastructure has never been better. He has a tax regime that is the lowest in terms of small business, and construction is a small business industry. There'll be no small business tax. Our income tax is the lowest. Those are the things that you need to bring people here to say, I want to build my business here because I can benefit from the wealth I create, and that wealth creates jobs, pays taxes, that pays for health care and education, all the things citizens want.
He did a lot of building. I mean, there's highways all over this province that have Gordon Campbell's name on them. There's bridges that have their name on them. I mean, you know, metaphorically. But I mean, he did a lot of building, and but I think the biggest building he did was with the economy overall.
Some people would suggest that the NDP didn't do very much in their time, and so there was this deficit, this infrastructure deficit. Right. Is that part of it?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about it. That there was a huge opportunity, and the biggest thing on Gordon Campbell's agenda was turning the province around, turning the economy around. And one of the ways he saw to do that was through infrastructure, through building this province. I don't think that there's been a period in the province's history since W.E.C. Bennett that's seen as much building as Gordon Campbell's time.
Now, is there a penalty you pay for doing all that infrastructure in such a short period of time? Is it expensive? Is there a deficit component to that?
I don't think so. I think that was the one. I think that will be one of his greatest legacies as premier. I think if anything, it helped drive his economic agenda, which is really, that will be probably one of his strongest suits.
What we decided was we were going to actually lift our economy up. When I first ran for office, I said we're striving for a new era of hope and prosperity. We want people to know they can be entrepreneurial. You really have to make the investments in our transportation infrastructure, our healthcare infrastructure. And you can only do that when you have a strong private sector economy. So from the outset, our first goal was to leave more money in people's pockets. That's why they had the largest single income tax reduction in history the first day in office. And actually last Wednesday, the second largest was done. And that's really to help drive the economy forward, which lifts the whole province up. And I think that's critically important. So, you know, I'll let other people talk about my legacy. What I would like to be able to say to myself, and I can look in the mirror, and I can say I always tried to do what I thought was right in my heart. I hoped it was in the long-term interest of British Columbians, and I can tell you this. I've got 3 grandsons now. I can look at every single one of them and said, I did the best I could for you. Not necessarily for me, but for you. So whether it's dealing with a new relationship for First Nations, meeting and facing the challenge of climate change, which is there, whether we want to look it in the eye or not, making sure we have a strong economy that creates new opportunities for them, opening the new gateway to the Asia Pacific and all of the enormous richness of opportunity that creates. Those are things that I'm proud that I've at least started. There's a long way to go, and I should say this to you, Mark, there is never a time when the job is done in public life. You know, you have to be able to say to yourself, it's about moving the province forward. I think we're going to have a great leadership race. I think we've got some great people that will run for leader. I think they will have, you know, some new ideas and new vision for where the province should go in the next decade, and that's good for everybody.
Well, I do think that one of the areas that the Premier's worked very hard on and has improved in this province is our relationship with the federal government. We've had very fractured relationships, again, part of being in the West, I believe, with the federal government of all political parties. And the Premier's worked very hard to improve that relationship. That's been to the benefit of British Columbia. I think we've had a much better relationship. I think we've seen resources planned better between the federal and the provincial government. That's certainly something that I'd want to continue, and I think the Premier gets credit for that, building that kind of relationship that is healthy for our province.
What have you learned from this experience in these last few months?
Oh, wow. Well, I think that the main thing that I've seen, and I think it's a real shift that's taking place, we're seeing it all across North America, is that we're going to have to find new ways of engaging people in really all of the major public issues that we face. People want to be involved, they want to be fully engaged, and I think that's going to be critically important, because if we don't find ways that we're acting together as a province, as a country, we're going to lose opportunities. So I really think there's a major opportunity here for British Columbians to come together to say this is where we can go in the next decade of the 21st century. And I think it'll be great for everyone.
You can't run a province, can't run a country if you just look at personalities and not policies.
But him just leaving, now that seems to be a systemic problem, right? So him leaving, and then the poor next guy that comes along, or next woman that comes along, is going to face the same thing in a few years. Is he or she not?
No, I think that's one of the problems. I think he said it himself, you know, is this focus on personalities and rather than on the policies. I'd rather people talk about the policies, just the benefits of the policies.
But how do we change the system so that happens?
I don't know. I think we have to do a better job. You have to do a better job. I think the media focus on personalities rather than on the policies. Let's talk about the policies. There's so much misinformation and misunderstanding about the HST that it was just easier to blame somebody about it rather than learn about it.
Is it that the tax was complex?
I think it was the way it was brought in, the lack of communication around the way it was brought in, you know, people make up their mind pretty quickly. It became more of an emotional issue than a rational issue. And frankly, you can't deal with emotional issues by giving people more facts. You have to deal with it on an emotional basis.
Do you think he learned anything through this experience?
Oh, I think so, without question. I mean, he himself said he wished he would have dealt with it differently. We agree on that. I guess on the go-forward basis is where we disagree. I felt we should have put the brakes on immediately, stopped the HST, engaged with the federal government. I believe we have the ability.
Would you like to negotiate with them?
Well, you know, we have to repay the $1.6 billion. Now, that money was going to be spent either way. It was going to be spent through deficit budget, or it was going to be spent as a result of the money transferred from the federal government. That money pays for programs, and the public, I think right now we have to, as a province, engage in a full public dialogue between government and the population to say, here's where we're at today. Here's the services we're all demanding right across this province. But the reality is we don't have the ability to pay for all these services, and the thought of spending more money every day to deliver programs that we all like and enjoy but can't pay for, we're going to come to a harsh reality very quickly.
Well, you know, it's an interesting time in politics, I think, not simply here in BC, but in fact all across the country, down south of the border. It's a time when the public has really disconnected with political parties, with political systems.
The Tea Party thing.
Exactly, and we saw it in the last election. We had one of the lowest voter turnouts we've seen in British Columbia in our last provincial election.
That's bad, isn't it?
That's terrible for democracy. It's never mind political parties. This isn't about political parties or about me as leader or someone else. This is about democracy. When people don't feel that they can have any influence, when they feel like every politician is the same, that's a really unhealthy democratic society.
And now a final note. Just a week after Premier Campbell announced he's leaving politics, the woman who you would expect to benefit most from that announcement, Carol James, is facing a leadership crisis of her own. A growing number of people within the NDP are now wondering aloud why her polling numbers are so low, and wondering whether or not it's not time to replace Carol James at the head of the NDP.